Happy 4th of July from Partners in True Crime.
This week on My Uncle's Escaped from Alcatraz, we're going to do a best of, and then we'll be back next week and we're going to have Art Roderick on, and he was the U.S. Marshal who's been investigating the escape from Alcatraz. So please stay tuned. We'll see you next week, but enjoy the first 4 episodes best of.
Happy 4th of July.
Okay, we're ready.
All right. So we're really excited to start a new podcast with 2 really interesting gentlemen, and one which is a relative of 2 of the people who escaped Alcatraz Island. And I don't know anybody who doesn't know what Alcatraz is, and I don't know anybody who doesn't know about the famous escape from Alcatraz. There's been a lot of lore. There's been a lot of myths about whether or not they actually made it. There's been a movie that Clint Eastwood made that, used some of the elements, but wasn't completely accurate of what was going on. But it was an entertaining movie to kind of show if, in fact, someone could escape from Alcatraz Island. There's been a few documentaries about it. But on this podcast, we're going to hear it from the horse's mouth, or a relative from the horse's mouth. And we have Ken Widener and Mike Lynch. Ken is the nephew, correct, of the 2 gentlemen
that's correct.
Right? Okay. And Mike Lynch is his co-author of the book that's coming out in May. So it's going to be available this May. And so during the run-up to the promotion and when the book is launched, we're going to be talking about this, and we're going to be talking about it even after the launch, because there's so much information about this. There's a lot of theories, and there's a lot of information that both Mike and Ken have unearthed over the years. And we're so excited to have them on here. Mike and Ken, thank you for being on the podcast and joining us on this journey through your childhood, Ken, and all your research, Mike. So
before we get started, though, can you tell us the name of the book so everyone can look out for it when it's launched in May?
Sure. The name of the book is Alcatraz, The Last Escape.
Okay, great.
The name Last Escape, most people would assume that we're referring to Alcatraz, but it does have a little twist to it.
Yeah, there was an escape attempt after John and Clarence Anglin got out of the prison. It was some months later, so it wasn't technically the last Alcatraz escape, but like Ken said, it's discussing something else.
Got it. So let's start off. Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, your unique family background, and your connection to the Anglin brothers, and just tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So, as you said, my uncles are John and Clarence from my mother's side of the family. I first got introduced to the Alcatraz story when I was a year and a half old. I actually sat on my mom's lap as she watched the breaking news story of her 2 brothers as they were being plastered onto the screen, their wanted pictures. And I sat in her lap as we watched the story unfold on live TV. I physically never met John and Clarence. Now, I did meet the 3rd brother. There's actually 3 brothers that were involved in the bank robbery that we'll eventually kind of get into. But I did actually meet him before his death in prison also. So my mom comes from a large family of 14. John was number 6 in the lineup. Clarence was number 7, and my mother was number 10. So very large family. I have been experiencing Alcatraz all of my life. I probably didn't embrace it as much as I did starting in 2012. Growing up as a teenager, you pretty much try not to be someone who stands out in school. So I didn't really kind of talk about my past with my uncles until like I said, in 2012, which we can talk about that in a few minutes.
Did you meet your uncles? Did you know them?
I never met John and Clarence. Like I said, I was born in 1961. They were already in Alcatraz at that time. Actually, Clarence showed up to Alcatraz from Leavenworth, where he had helped an escape plan with John, and he wound up showing up at Alcatraz just a few weeks before I was born. So did I physically meet them? No, but I knew all of the other family members, my aunts and uncles, and like I said, I did have the opportunity to be the last nephew to meet Alfred before his death in prison.
And your family, I mean, having something like this happen in your family, it's tragic, but it's also, like you said, you didn't want the attention. So was it difficult for your mom and your family to deal with this over the years? How did they work through that?
I would say the difficulty came from, at first, the FBI was very harsh on the family. Some of the stories that we can get into that I know happened. I know several FBI agents who came to our house as I grew up, questioning my mom over the number of years. And then eventually the U.S. Marshals took over, and we thought pretty much we had been left alone at that time. And we find out years later that we were actually being surveilled. So we were actually being followed, and our phones were actually being tapped. Some people say, well, that's just, you're just making that up. But we actually found out that actually happened. Yeah. And even today, they do keep tabs on some of us, which is pretty amazing. I mean, it's 60-something years, and the possibility of my uncle still being alive is very slim. They would be in their 90s, and none of the Anglin brothers ever lived to be that age. So, but it was hard on them, because every time we got together every year for our Anglin reunion, they were missed along with Alfred. And so it was a big hole in the family. But I think over the years, they've come not so much to learn to not talk about it as they now like to share it. So it's really something that we want to get out and tell the true story about what actually happened.
Yeah. Well, let me just, how did you and Mike connect and how long have you guys known each other?
So and then I'll let Mike jump in. I can talk forever on this story, but as you can tell, in 2012, I had it's really what turned my kind of desire to tell the story was when I took my mom and her sister, the only two living relatives still left alive today, out to Alcatraz for the 50th anniversary. And while we were out there on the island, we were giving some interviews with some local news stations, and I believe there were some from around the world that had set up, the park rangers. And at the table was the current U.S. Marshal that was working the case, and I was beside him, my mom and her sister. And then on the other side was a writer, a famous writer for Alcatraz, and one of the guards. And anyway, one of the individuals made a very disparaging comments about my uncles. Basically said, well, the whole thing was constructed by Frank Morris, and John and Clarence were a third, grade educated hicks, and they were lucky to be included. And I just got so mad. I said, that is not how it happened. I cannot believe that. So I made it my life mission to write this story. And I originally started out in 2016, and I wrote a screenplay. And of course, it really didn't. So I was told it was looked at by Clint Eastwood, and they said, well, it was very amateur, which it probably was. I'm not a writer. And so somehow Mike had saw something that I had posted on Facebook, and he reached out to me, and it took a number of years for him to convince me to because I was going to shelve the thing. I just wasn't going to do anything with it after being told that it wasn't that great. And so Mike took a look at it and he said, hey, we can construct this into a really good book. And with his help, which I could not have done it without him, it's turned into what we have today.
Mike, tell us a little bit about what you thought was unique about this idea and why you felt that this story needs to be told in a different way.
So Ken was almost right about how we met. Got a little bit, not quite the details correct, but I'll be happy to tell the truth here. When in 2015, 3 years after he did the visitation to Alcatraz for the 50th anniversary, he did a TV documentary on the History Channel called Alcatraz: Search for the Truth. And I've grown up in the Bay Area, so I'm very familiar with Alcatraz. I visited there in the early 80s, and then I also saw the Clint Eastwood movie in 79. And I also have a passion for history. When I graduated from college, I was a history major. So I love history. And so growing up in the Alcatraz, in the shadow of Alcatraz, always wondering whatever happened to those three. A lot of people who live in the area just, you think about it, you wonder about it. You visit San Francisco and you see it, it's right there in the Bay. You can't miss it. And of course, in the movie that Clint Eastwood did, they leave the ending a little ambiguous. It sort of hints at that they survived, but of course they don't come down either way. They just sort of, lead up to that and just let the audience decide for themselves what happened. So again, it's just the ongoing question of, did they make it or did they not make it? And then when I saw the promo for the documentary that Ken had done, I hadn't met him. I didn't know who he was at the time. I thought, Search for the Truth. That sounds really interesting. And it was a 2-hour documentary. And, he and his brother David met with Art Roderick, who was a U.S. Marshal who had the case for a time. And then he was retired when they did the show. And Ken and his brother produced the now famous photograph of what they believed to be John and Clarence some years later. And some other documents that indicated very strongly that they did survive and that they were still alive at the time. And I was just very intrigued by that. I thought, wow, here is some real evidence to show that they did make it. And in the documentary, even Art was very impressed because he said, really, since the early 1960s, there really hadn't been any credible leads to John, Clarence, and Frank after the escape. It basically has become a cold case. And when Ken and David produced that photograph, he was duly impressed. And so the remainder of the episode was examining some other pieces of evidence and also trying to answer the question of what happened to Alfred when he died in prison in 1964 under very mysterious circumstances, which I'm sure we'll talk about in future episode.
Most definitely.
And so when I saw that, I thought, I just have to be a part of this. I have to be a part of this story. There's obviously a bigger story here. And so I reached out to Ken. I didn't know where he was. I just had to do a search for him on the internet. And I finally tracked him down through his not TikTok. It was
Facebook.
Facebook. It wasn't Facebook. It wasn't your Facebook page. It was your tweet. You had a Twitter account.
Oh, okay.
I found you on Twitter, of all places, and reached out to you. I said, I'm a writer. I saw the story. I'd be interested in talking to you. And then Ken responded, and we had a phone call, I believe it was. And he was very cordial, very nice about it, but he would politely said, thank you for the offer, but I've already got a script. Under the advice of my lawyer, I can't release any information to you. But thank you for reaching out. And I didn't realize at the time that Ken actually did not have a lawyer. He was just sort of, very politely.
I was trying to be nice.
Hollywood game. Playing the Hollywood game.
You learned
trying to be
quickly,
nice.
Ken. Very fast learner.
So I do have, obviously a writing background. I published books before. This isn't my first book, and I have since branched out to screenplays. And Ken had mentioned that he had written a screenplay about his uncles, and I said, well, you really have to be careful, because when you send a screenplay to a producer or a director or whomever in the film industry, that script has to be good to go. It can't be mostly good or mostly ready. It has to be 100%, because if it's not polished and ready, they're going to reject it. And so over the course of a year, I reached out to Ken from time to time, because I wasn't going to give up on this, and just sort of would check in with them saying, how's it going? How's your plan to get this filmed? And, he would just kind of like, oh, it's going okay, and just kept it short. And then after a year, he had sort of exhausted all of his possibilities of trying to get this thing produced, try to get it made. And he finally sent it to me, finally sent me the script, thinking, well, maybe this guy can do something for me. He says he's a screenwriter. Maybe he can help me out with this, because everything I've tried hasn't worked. Now, what I also have learned in the meantime was that Ken wasn't sure if I was being honest with him about who I was, because of prior experiences in his family of people who have purported to be supporters of the family and of the story and wanted to tell the story, but were really actually working for the Marshals or associated with the Marshals, trying to get information from the family. And so they were using different duplicitous means to get the location of where the uncles were, because the authorities have been convinced since the beginning, you know where they are, we know you're lying, we know you're covering for them, and if we find out that you are, you're going to prison. And they threatened him many times that way. And so they didn't know if I was one of those people. So Ken was naturally very guarded when I reached out to him saying, hey, I want to help you, because they've been burned in the past before. But eventually I convinced him that I was who I was. And we decided to try to get a TV show produced, and we worked on a script, and then which eventually led to the book.
Right. You almost sometimes wanted to ask my grandfather, you didn't have a lot of money, and what in the world possessed you to have 14 children? But I think back then it was pretty common for large families to live together and help each other out. And that was really kind of the driving force that I believe that every one of my aunts and uncles, including my mom, when my mom was growing up, it was just known that she was going to work on the farm. And in fact, after she got married my father, they both worked as laborers on a farm. And I believe all of the children saw that as their future. I don't think any of them ever saw, oh, I can become a doctor one day, or a lawyer, or, and I can get out of this lifestyle. And I believe every one of them, knowing that this was their destiny, is pretty much what kind of drove Alfred and John and Clarence to say, I don't want a part of this. I see my mom struggling. I've seen her, crying and taking care of 14 kids, barely able to get by. I'm, going to school and clothes that my mom had to make out of a sackcloth, and taking baths on a porch in a wash tub in front of your other siblings. I just think that's what drove them to say, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be a farmer, which is kind of ironic, because later in life, they actually become farmers, but at the time they wanted what they saw other kids having in their school, because not every kid in their school was that poor, so they were probably at the very bottom. And then they saw things in life, and like any other kid, they wanted more than what they were getting. So.
Now, reading in the book about their early childhood and their experience in school, it was apparent that both of them, a lot of them, they got teased and they got bullied in school. And was that because they were poor?
Yes. I remember my mom telling me that when they lived in Donaldsonville, well, they actually lived in a little town called Iron City, which was between Donaldsonville, Georgia, and Colquitt, Georgia. They went to school in Donaldsonville, but even there they got bullied because of how poor they were. Moving to Ruskin, I believe they all thought, okay, we're going to have a fresh start. There are other farmers down here that's just like us. But my mom said they quickly learned that as soon as they got to school, and it wasn't just John and Clarence that got bullied. Every single one of them did. And John and Clarence and Alfred are just the ones that said they were not taking it anymore. And so they always wound up in fights or, they were the ones getting in trouble, but it was because they were being picked on. And eventually that just drove them to the point that they said, no more school for me. Because they had a better time not going to school than they did going to school.
And they didn't really see a future with school. I mean, if they were just going to be farmers, what do they need school for?
One of the things that we talked about in our previous episode was when they moved from Georgia to Florida, they bought their the land. I think Ken said it was 9 acres altogether. They didn't have a house. It was just basically a piece of land the father bought, and he had a little bit of money to buy the land, and they actually lived in tents for quite a while, and there were a lot of trees on the property. So eventually he cuts down the trees and takes the lumber to a sawmill, and that was the materials that he used to actually build the house. He built the house himself with the help of his children and some others. So it was, word probably got out pretty quickly when the family moved down to Ruskin that they had really no home. They were kind of homeless in a way, and they were living in tents. So I'm sure they were easy pickings for the other kids to make fun of because of that. That's how poor they were.
Right.
Wow.
In a typical day, I remember my mom telling me this, a typical day in their life would be getting up early. They would eat breakfast. They had chores that they had to do before they went to school. Many times because of the chores, they would miss the bus and they would have to walk to school, which was about a mile. I used to always joke with her, going uphill both ways in the snow, but they truly did walk to school. And then after they got back from school, every one of them had to go into the family farm field and help either whatever they were growing and picking. And then from there, they went and had what they used to call supper. Sometimes I call dinner. But from there, it was doing homework, taking a bath, going to bed. There were no TV at that time. There was no radio. There was no electricity in the house. And so it was pretty much going to bed, and then you start the whole cycle all over again. So their life was, to me, I would look at it as miserable. But my mom has a lot of fond memories of that time.
Yeah, well, it looks like they made their own fun. I mean, they were big swimmers. They loved finding these hidden spots that they used to like go swimming and everything like that. There's a great story, I guess, when they went and claimed this one spot and then they ran it to someone else. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that story?
Sure. So when they first moved to Ruskin, as Mike said, they didn't own the farm that they eventually bought, the 9 acres. That came after they got there. Of course, it's not like today where you can get on the internet and go, I'll buy this piece of land and I've got it when I get there. When they arrived, they actually lived very close to a river that feeds into the Tampa Bay called the Alafai River. And that's where they had the tents at. And eventually they purchased the land that they would wind up on. But while they were living at the river, this is where they learned to enjoy and swim. This is where they actually ran into their very first meeting with Fred Breezy and his sister. Fred Breezy, his sister and mother and father lived not too far from the river, and they too would go down as kids and swim in this river. It was a pretty good sized river. And like I said, if you took it out straight out, it would go straight out into the Tampa Bay. And as kids, after they kind of, had a little turf war with Fred Breezy, which is really kind of funny because that did happen. They became very good friends with Fred, him and his sister. And eventually that's where they enjoyed most of their time, was in the water and swimming.
Mm-hmm. And Fred Breezy would also play a later role in something else that happened with the brothers as well, too, right? And you spent some time in the reform school.
Yeah, as children in a small town, I'm sure the area to get in mischief wasn't just dedicated to poor people. Fred Breezy and his family were not poor compared to the Anglin brothers. And, John and Clarence, that was just something that drew them into that lifestyle, was because they didn't have anything. Not so much true with Fred. I think Fred was just disillusioned child like today, wanting to, have fun. There wasn't a whole lot at that time in Ruskin, Florida. That was a very small town. I think the largest town would have definitely been Tampa, but that was a pretty good little ways away. And as a kid, you didn't have access to that. So I can see that, both of them doing things that eventually landed them in trouble. What landed John and Clarence and Alfred was they started skipping school to begin with, which is what landed them into reform school. At some point in time, I believe it was actually written in a newspaper one time that it was after the escape, they talked to one of her teachers, and she commented that John and Clarence and Alfred would much rather be swimming than they would in school. And so a lot of times they just skipped school. There was a river that was very close to the school, and they would walk to school like they were going, but then they would just go down this train tracks down to this train trestle that crossed over the river. And I believe it was called the Little Manatees.
Yeah.
And that's where they would swim until it was time to come home, and they would come home. And then eventually the school went to the family and said, hey, you either put them in school or they're going to reform school.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time in those rivers and in Tampa in the past year working with a diver, and those waters are probably more dangerous than the San Francisco Bay. We've seen bull sharks, manatees, stingrays, sharks, gators, fire ants. I mean, you name it, it's there to kill you in Florida for sure. So I think the San Francisco Bay is a little safer compared to those areas if they're swimming.
Well, it's where they got their training, obviously, if they're swimming every day.
If you're swimming in those rivers every day, I don't think you'd be afraid of much.
And there, where they eventually wound up living, their house as they got older and the house was completed, it was only a mile down to what's called Bahia Beach, which is a beach that is in Ruskin, Florida, and it's a beach that's, you can see it's in the bay. So all of their swimming that they did, it was either in Bahia Beach or Apollo Beach, which was in between Ruskin and Tampa. And like you said, the Tampa Bay is a lot like the San Francisco Bay. There is one way in and out, which is up under the Skyway Bridge in Tampa. And of course, in the San Francisco, it's the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yep. And
so a lot of those same type currents occur in both areas. And they would many times would swim. And I heard my several uncles talk about how that they would just swim all the way out to where the bridge, back then it was an older bridge, and back. And sometimes they would swim 10, 15 miles. So
I was going to say, it's at least 10, 15. I mean, it's far.
Yes. There was, my uncle did say one time that Clarence swam 30 miles. Now, I don't know. So he said this occurred when he was escaping. It was on the run, trying to make it back to the house. So a total of 30 miles that he swam. So, I mean, people sometimes when they think about the escapees and the Alcatraz piece of it, they think, in fact, I've even heard some people say, well, they drowned because the only swimming experience they had was in these little creeks and streams. But that's not even coming close to being true.
So, Ken, what I'd love to talk about today is, I think we left off is the Fred Breezy, and we touched on him a little bit on the last podcast and how they met him and everything. But I'd love to kind of, for our audience, just kind of review a little bit of that and then kind of jump into the next phase of what those guys were dealing with, as far as, you know, when Fred went to New Mexico for a little bit, then came back, and then a lot of interesting things there. And then there's the whole LA connection, the Mickey Cohen connection, how they met Mickey Cohen through Fred Breezy. So kind of start laying it out for us and kind of paint the picture of how that connection happened, because later on, what people don't know is that plays a really important part in their escape.
Yes, and it does, because to think about the escape, you really have to kind of think about that they had help. It wasn't a just get down to the bay, to the water line in the bay, and okay, what do we do next? So they had a plan and they had help, and we would find out later as we started kind of doing some digging that it was one of their childhood friends. You referenced him, Fred Breezy. We bring him early into the story because he plays a major role in the story. I didn't really kind of realize how close they were. I don't ever remember my family mentioning Fred Breezy at all, even though he went to school with a lot of the England family. He lived very close to them, and John and Clarence were very close to him. I don't ever remember hearing his name until I will have to say he was the patriarch of the England family after my grandfather died. And we bring him into the story because he's very instrumental in setting up the escape plan on the outside. And we'll talk about their older brother, Robert England, a little later. But he is the first time that I really kind of met Fred Breezy when he came to the England family gathering in 1992. And he told the story of him going down to Brazil, meeting with the brothers, taking the photographs that he eventually shared with the family. He gave a lot of detail about where they lived at and the farm. And so when we started kind of doing the book, I said, okay, there's got to be way more to Fred Breezy than what we've heard in the 1992 interview that was done. So as we started digging through historical records and newspapers, we started uncovering where not only was Fred Breezy friends with them when he was small, but he also got in trouble with them around the same time that they, like I said, they wound up in Mariana and a boys' industrial school. Fred Breezy was there at the exact same time. They just became, according to Fred, kind of painted it as, that they were childhood friends. And then he didn't run into them again until he met them in Brazil, which is kind of a crazy story to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But as you started listening to the interview he gave to the England family in 92, he gave such detailed information about the escape that only someone either with the knowledge of physically being there when it happened, or he would have had access to the FBI files, which we know wasn't released until early 2000s. So he had no access to these files, and yet he was able to say and give information that is only in those files. So that really kind of, for me and Mike, I don't know about Mike, but it did for me. It really, to me, gave me hard evidence that he was participating in this escape. And then we go back into, of course, he was a drug dealer. He got into flying his airplane, taking drugs out of South America. And so as we started peeling the onion back, so to speak, and we started looking at early lives of Fred Breezy, we see where he not only help them in the escape, but he's also the one who introduces them to Mickey Cohen.
Yeah.
Fred was early into the drug business. And
let me stop you right there, because I'd love to kind of ramp up in there, because there's a lot of cool information that leads up to that.
Okay.
And that how Fred Breezy, he went back. He lived in New Mexico for a little bit of time because his family had to move there because there was no jobs in Florida, and his father had to take a electrician job to work on a dam out there, and so they were out there for a little bit. He came back, and then he reconnected with those guys, and then he kept on getting in trouble with the brothers, and all these little things that they were doing, these heists and stealing stuff and everything. And so the father, according to the book, said that he wanted him to get his pilot's license. Maybe, hopefully, that'll get him off the crime spree that he's been doing and doesn't turn into a criminal. Ironically, that it did just the opposite. And so talk about the story. I love the story when he went back to visit a friend of his in New Mexico and how he got introduced into the drug trafficking world.
Okay. Well, so after, Mike, you can jump in with some of this too, because I know me and you both did this digging into the piece of this story. But we do know that Fred, when he came back with his family after being pulled from Ruskin, Florida, or the area that he was growing up in, all the way into just outside of Tucumcari, New Mexico, which I've been there before. Believe it or not, I have a relative that used to live there. Didn't even know that. And I've been there, and it's a very desolate place. Even when I went in, 1988. So I can imagine what it looked like back in the early 50s, late 40s. And so, we just know that once he got out there, he was not very happy, him or his sister. They eventually, after the project is completed, they moved back to the Ruskin, Tampa Bay area, where he connects back with John and Clarence. And from there, you can pretty much look at his rap sheet and you can compare it to John and Clarence's. They pretty much picked up where they left off. It was like they had never been separated. And one would get in trouble, the other wouldn't get in trouble. And it's kind of funny, you think about John and Clarence and going, well, they're coming from a poor family. They're doing this because they're trying to survive and they want a better life. But then you look at Fred Breezy, and it's just the opposite. His family had money. They had, he didn't need to do this kind of stuff that he was doing, but yet I think it was the draw of the excitement. He was bored. And at some point in time, his father thought that him taking flying lessons would actually kind of calm him down a little bit, which you would kind of think that it would. It gave him another interest to doing other things. And from there, his father thought, okay, it would be a good time, since one of his friends that he met while he was out working on the dam invited him to come back out. They actually had stayed there, whereas Fred Breezy's family moved back. And so Fred drives out there. And, it's his kind of first time being back. He's off on his own, not with his mom and dad anymore. And this is where he gets introduced into the drug business. His friend, who he had spent several years with there at the dam, started showing him, hey, I'm driving this brand new car that he was able to obtain. Fred couldn't understand how he got this. And he eventually introduced him into the business that he was dealing in. Well, lo and behold, he was actually working for Mickey Cohen at that time. It was very well known that Mickey had his drug fingers throughout most of the United States, especially in California.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, why don't you give us a little background on Mickey for people who don't know who Mickey Cohen is?
Yeah.
So he was actually from New York. He was, a young Jewish kid living in kind of the ghetto area of New York. Like so many other migrant families. They arrive in New York. Many of them stay there. They're just sort of in these tenement housing, very cramped, very poor conditions. And in the early 1900s, he's a scrappy little kid, and he actually gets into boxing for a time. He was a pretty good little boxer, but the thing that kind of like the brothers, the thing that kind of really lured him was organized crime or crime in the streets. That whole environment. We've seen a number of movies like Godfather and there was another one. I forget the name of it.
Goodfellas.
It's something about America. I remember America was
Once Upon a Time in America.
Yeah, Once Upon a Time in America. Just that kind of a story. That was really Mickey's story. And had talent, had ability, and you start small. You start doing things on the street for the drug guys or for the mob guys. And if you showed ability, you just kind of worked your way up the ranks, which he did. If you know the person, like Bugsy Malone, he was working with Bugsy Malone for a time when they came out to Vegas and organized crime.
Bugsy Siegel? Bugsy Siegel?
Oh, I'm sorry. Bugsy Malone is another movie. I'm sorry. Yeah, Bugsy Siegel. Excuse me. Yeah,
but he didn't like being called Bugsy. He was Ben Siegel.
He hated that name. Yeah. So just worked his way up, made his way to Las Vegas. That's really where he established himself as kind of like more of like a kingpin of organized crime, and then later moved to Los Angeles. But like Ken said, like a lot of the mob people, it really started in the 1920s when Prohibition was in effect, and all the rum runners and the illegal alcohol, that's really where organized crime really got its start and became a national issue for the United States government. And Mickey Cohen was a part of that, and then later moved into the drug trade. And as he established his empire, it was easier for him, and he was better protected by, for example, he had marijuana farms in Mexico, and then later branched out to Central and South America for the cocaine trade. But that was some years later. So, it's like a business. You start off small locally, and you just sort of gradually get bigger and bigger, and your reach gets stronger and stronger as he's making connection with other mob guys. And in the late 1940s, when he and Fred Breezy crossed paths, when, like Ken said, the way we lay it out in the book is, he goes out to New Mexico, he meets his friend. Well, his friend's he's basically a drug guy. He picks up the drugs, drops it off, and then gets paid for it. He was kind of like a delivery boy. And the reason that we have Fred go out to New Mexico is the friend wrote him a letter, and because he'd become aware, he was friends with Fred's sister, and they had written to each other, and the sister had mentioned that Fred had gotten his pilot's license. And so he brings him out there and kind of tests the water. He doesn't tell him at first why he's there, just like, hey, just want to get caught up. But then later, when Fred was asking about, hey, how come you have all this money? How come you have this nice car? Then he takes him out to this remote location where there's a drug deal going on, and the friend gives him the money, the guy, or the drugs, the guy gets the money, and then he tells Fred what he's really doing. And because he has a pilot's license, he can do a lot for for Mickey Cohen. And then Fred thinks about it, and because he has a little bit of a troubled past, as we'll call it, with some incarcerations from time to time, he sees, like the brothers, it's like, he can start making some real money, big money. And he goes out to Los Angeles and meets with Mickey Cohen, who decides to give him a job as a drug runner, being a pilot now. And then so going down to Mexico and flying the drugs from Mexico to Los Angeles and other places. So that's where Fred really gets a start in the mob.
Wow, I love the story when they goes out there and he gets introduced to Mickey Cohen at that cabaret club.
Yeah,
Ken, tell us about that, Ken.
Well, he goes out. He doesn't really kind of know what to expect. He's told where to go, and so as he shows up at the club, he's seated, and lo and behold, here comes Mickey Cohen in and sits down beside him, and this is his first introduction, I believe, into a strip club. because here comes eventually Candy Barr, who is, I'm not so sure she was as much in love with Mickey Cohen as he was with her. He was infatuated with her. And, so here, Fred Breezy is trying to have a serious conversation with Mickey Cohen. And he's like, well, let's wait until after the show, So Fred really kind of felt odd, which I would have too, if I'm sitting here about to do business with someone and, your girlfriend you just told me is fixing to strip in front of all of us. So you don't really kind of know how to act with that. You just kind of go, you don't know whether or not to applaud or not to applaud. So,
yeah, you don't want to look too enthused in front of your potential new boss.
Exactly. But I believe that was a good introduction for the two to meet because, Fred, like Mike said, he was a wild child. He wanted to do something. He wanted to make money. I don't think he had any interest in going into the same business that his father was, any more than John and Clarence had any intention of going into business like their father was. And so when Mickey Cohen, propositions him with this new business venture, using him and his talents with the flying, Fred pretty much thinks of his two friends. Actually, there was three, not just John and Clarence at the time. There was Alfred. And it was an opportunity for him to bring in John and Clarence and Alfred and explore with Mickey, saying, hey, I know you have this great business that you're moving drugs out of. And he never liked really calling it drugs. He called it products. But he, bringing this information, this product out of Mexico into California, Fred was like, okay, that's great, but have you ever thought about growing the stuff here and in the U.S. itself? Well, I don't know if it had ever really kind of been done through Mickey's organization, but once Fred told Mickey about what the England brothers had the ability to do. I mean, regardless, when they were growing up, if they couldn't do anything else, they were fantastic farmers. My grandfather could grow anything. And of course, his sons were pretty much in that same line. They had access to a farm. They had access to be able to grow stuff in a remote area that very few people would have access to. And so, Mickey explores this with Fred and said, okay, I'm willing to give y'all a chance if you want to go back and speak to the brothers and see if they would be interested in doing this. And that's really where the part of the book really kind of takes off in that connection with Mickey Cohen.
But let's start off with John, because John seemed to fall in love with somebody, and someone that he knew from a very young age, and they were always very friendly to each other. But as they got older, they realized there was a big attraction there, how that led to, and like all the guys were starting to get involved with people, and how that kind of complicated their crime life. Because it was, what I found was really interesting is they, on paper, and the way you guys talk about them in the book, and the way, Ken, you talked about them, I mean, they still have very strong moral character because of the way they were raised by their mother. And, being able to raise 14 kids like that and keep everybody together and going to church. I mean, they were doing all these thefts and stuff, and they were still going to church with their parents. Every Sunday. They were good at home. They were good. They were just outside. They were mischievous, and they're trying to make money. They didn't like being poor. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So, gosh, as they got older, like I said, the life that they saw themselves coming up in, following their father's footstep, wasn't something that was attractive to them. I mean, they had already been harassed, bullied, teased in elementary school. It's one of the reasons why when they got into middle school, they pretty much said, okay, I've had enough of it. But, that lifestyle is really what kind of set them into where they wound up at. But it also, anytime that they met someone that accepted them as who they were, they became very loyal and good friends with them. Case in point, Fred Breezy. There were very few, to my knowledge, that they had. Now, one was, we touched a little bit about the love of his life. In fact, one of his letters that he wrote from Alcatraz to his mom, he spoke about Helen, and he called her his queen. And he even stated, I would marry her in an instant if I had the opportunity. So Helen, at a young age, while they were in elementary school, was kind of like Fred Breezy, showed John some compassion, friendship, and John just fell head over heels with her. But like most people in that town, there were two sides of a railroad tracks. You were on the right side or the left side. And of course, they were on the left side. Helen and her family were on the right side, so to speak, And it was like a Romeo and Juliet. Her father did not want her having anything to do with the Anglin family, especially John. They were prone, even as young kids, to be in trouble. You see that as people read the book, you'll hear of stories of them getting into trouble during school. Some of it was their fault, some was not their fault. But still, it was a Romeo and Juliet type scenario. So, that pretty much, like I said, will set the stage for what people will read in the book about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really, it was sad that he was so, he's a young boy and he becomes friends with this girl. And then the father says, you're not allowed to talk to him anymore. And, she's young. She's like, what, 12 years old, 13 years old? I mean, what are you going to do? You have to listen to your dad. But it just seemed like it didn't matter. They were going to come back together no matter what, even after she got married.
Well,
so it's like one of those faded things.
Remember about her family is the family, they had money. They were in the upper socioeconomic class of the community. And of course, this is back in the, 50s, and, social class was very important. And when she was 16, dad bought her a car, something that most people couldn't even dream of being so young and getting a new car from your father. And it was, it was a status thing for the family. Like, look how much money we have, look what we can give our children. And, then you have the Anglin family, the dirt poor farmers, and, the two of them, smitten with each other. The father's like, yeah, I'm not having it. No way are you going to be with him. He's trouble. He gets into trouble all the time. They have no money. You have better prospects waiting for you elsewhere. And, down the road, the father actually does sort of orchestrate a marriage for Helen with somebody else. But that's a little bit of a down the road story. And, Ken can fill in the gaps for that. But that's, that's how much the father was involved in her life, of trying to keep her on the straight and narrow. And then, of course, as you indicated, oftentimes when the parents say, he's bad, you can't be with him, what does that do for a lot of young girls? They want to be with them. They want to do what they want to do. So,
yeah.
Well, and, not only was there a restriction from Helen's side of the family for John, but there actually even became some upset parents, my grandparents, with the relationship that John was having with Helen, because, like you said, the Anglin family were very dedicated to going to church. And my mom tells, which we include in the book, is a very hilarious story. My grandfather always made everyone in the family go to church, and not only just Sunday morning, but it was Sunday evening and also Wednesday evening. But they were in church one evening, and my mom said that Helen came to the window of the church, knocked on it, and John saw her, and she motioned for him to come out. And Clarence is telling them, "You better sit still, because if Daddy sees you, you're in trouble." John takes off out of church, and him and Helen take off, and there's no telling where they went. But I think my grandparents sometimes saw Helen and her sister Ruth as almost kind of like a bad influence on John and Clarence, which is kind of ironic because her parents felt the same way about John and Clarence. So.
Yeah, no, it was really interesting. And I think that whole time after they came back from California that first time, that's when it all for John, he realized he needed to make a move, and he felt like he was in the position where he was on the potential of making some really good money, and he could provide for her the way he feels like he could provide for his queen. Right. And so that was kind of the thing. And I love the story, how he used, and you can tell this story about how he used his niece to use as kind of like a go-between at the beach to kind of ambush Helen when she was there with her current husband, and because he had gotten word that things weren't going really well in Paradise in that marriage, and he felt like he had an opening, and he immediately, being the conniving guy he is and the planner, right. He says, I gotta weigh in, and I'm gonna go do it.
Well, actually, I just want to add one story first before Ken tells that story, just to kind of give it a little bit more context. So after Helen graduated from high school, the father sent her away to Ohio, I believe, because he saw that, they were sneaking around together in high school in their early, 15, 16, 17, around that time. And both sides kind of finally sort of, realized everything we're doing isn't working. So the father sends her away in the hopes that she'll forget about John, move on. And John, of course they were both heartbroken, but they're teens, you move on. John kind of dated a little bit, in his own community. And then Helen eventually marries Jim McIntosh, who had an eye on her for a while. And then, with John out of the picture, he makes his move. She convinces her to marry him, and she does. And they're married for a couple of years, but it's not a happy marriage. She's, she misses her home. She misses John. She's just not the man for him. And so they return back to Ruskin. And when she returns, that's when John realizes, here's my opportunity to connect with her again. And that leads to the beach scene.
Right. And what is funny is that the niece is actually my oldest sister. And my mom told the story many times to me about how that John would come by the house and grab my sister Sue and carry her to the beach and ride around with her. And of course, we didn't realize at that time exactly what he was doing until we started kind of researching a little bit. But yeah, he would use my sister, riding her around as a way to interact with Helen. And Helen was very fond of children. As if you're trying to impress your girlfriend, you either have a dog or you have
bait. You had bait
or something, or a nephew. And so I'm sure John used that as a way of breaking the ice, with Helen again. But I've always believed that it was fate that Helen and John were supposed to be together. And like I said, Helen, I knew her, and my family kept in touch with her even after the escape. And she was always kind of a part of the family. She loved John very, very much. And it's, I can see them clicking back together. It didn't take long, but like Mike said, she had now a husband, which there are several stories that my mom has told me about incidents when they would go over to Helen's house and John and Clarence would be there, and Helen's husband would also be there. I'm sure it was a very weird situation. But Helen knew that John was her love, and John knew that Helen was his love.
Yeah. And I really love that beach scene where he starts chatting him up, and he immediately goes in for the jugular, and he basically says, he basically goes, doesn't sound like things are going too well here with this marriage.
That would be John.
Sounds like something you would say.
Yeah, that's pretty.
My Uncle John was very direct. My mom said he was always very funny. He was a jokester, but he was very serious, and he was very dedicated. Now, Clarence, of course, was the party-go-lucky guy.
but John was my mom said that's exactly how he would talk. He would go right for the jugular vein. He wouldn't hold back.
And then